At this time, I want to invite Rachael Pass, a fourth-year HUC Hebrew Union College rabbinical student. For the past 4 years, I've been hearing from everyone I know on Hebrew Union College faculty how wonderful Rachael is, how grateful they are to Louisville, Kentucky for having Rachael being raised, born, and educated at for what her experiences at the temple were. So we are so proud of you, Rachael, and please educate us.
Boker Tov, Shabbat Shalom. Thanks, Rabbi David. Making me blush. Everything about the day he proposed to me should have been perfect. I was wearing my favorite outfit. My hair was pulled back half up to show off the cuteness of my face to any onlookers. He came up behind me, tapped me on the shoulder. I turned around, surprised like in the movies, and Nicholas said, "Will you marry me?" My stomach dropped, revolted. I didn't know what to do. Later that afternoon, my mom would get a phone call from my kindergarten teacher at Knesset Israel preschool to talk about my behavior. I would get put in timeout for, as far as I can remember, the first time ever. I'd have to think about what I'd done and the next day at school, apologize. By age 5, I, like every other little girl I knew, already knew that that fate one day awaited me. That a boy I didn't particularly like would catch me off guard and ask me to marry him. And I'd have to say yes. No one had ever outright told me this, and I'm sure my mom is shocked to hear that that's what I'd learned from her. But by age 5, I knew that one day I'd have to marry a man. And by age 5, I knew that that was not what I wanted. So much so that when he had asked me to marry him, I had punched poor Nicholas in the face. Almost 20 years later, I sat in a small yellow painted room with my grandmother, having what I didn't know would be my last cogent conversation with her. Her Alzheimer's had progressed enough by that point that our conversation circled around and around, coming back to the same 3 topics over and over. One was teaching me inappropriate phrases in Yiddish, which I'm sure those of you who knew her are not surprised to hear. Another was talking about school and what my life was like in Boston. And the third topic that came up over and over again was that of my sexuality. At least 3 separate times and at least 3 separate versions of the same conversation, my grandma looked at me and said, "You know, Rachael, I always knew you preferred girls. I always knew you just preferred the company of women. Ever since you were a little girl, I just knew. You always preferred girls." I had never felt so seen in my entire life. She wasn't judging me or asking me. She was just stating a fact about me, like it was the color of my eyes or the waves of my hair. I could always tell you just preferred girls. I couldn't always tell. From that first moment of noticing something, from that day I punched poor Nicholas in the face, I had thought something was just different. Actually, I thought something was wrong. In 5th grade, when my friends started having crushes on boys, I pretended to have a crush on Walker Robinson, when actually all I wanted to do was follow Catherine Goldman around everywhere she went. In middle school, I dated Chase, whatever his name was, because someone said he liked me. But I couldn't stop thinking about a rumor going around school that Eliza Anderson was bisexual and how fascinating that made her to me. I didn't know what I was experiencing with Catherine or Eliza was a crush. I didn't know that that's what my friends felt or pretended to feel towards boys. I had no idea. I just thought there was something wrong with me because everyone was interested in boys and I wasn't. I'm not telling you these stories just so you can experience a moment of what my life was like growing up queer in Louisville. I'm telling you these stories because each and every one of you play a role in them, or have played a role in a million other stories like these. We are constantly communicating our expectations and assumptions, comforts and discomforts, whether or not we're aware of it. When I look at a young girl and I say, wow, aren't you cute? Before I say to her, wow, aren't you inquisitive? I am subtly conveying to her that her looks matter more than her curiosity, that her appearance matters more than her desire to learn. If I hear a Black activist speaking at a protest and I say, wow, she is so articulate, what I am saying is I'm communicating an assumption that Black people are less capable orators than white people, less educated or less smart. If I discover that a student of mine is trans and think, wow, he looks so masculine, I'd never know, I'm communicating an expectation that trans people must fit into stereotypical images of femininity or masculinity, that their worth as a trans person is somehow dependent on how well they pass. It is not. In this week's Parsha, Shalach Lecha, we are given a story that is all about the message underneath the words. God tells Moses to send scouts through Eretz Yisrael to report back on what they find. When Moses repeats this order to the scouts, however, he expands on God's original language. God had only said, send men to scout the land that I'm giving to the people of Israel. That's it. Send them to scout the land. Moses, instead, sends the scouts with specific questions. He asks, are the people who dwell there strong or weak? Are they few or many? Is the land good or bad? Are the towns open or fortified? Is the soil rich or poor, wooded or not? Don't forget, bring back some fruit. In changing the question, Moses conveys his expectations and his fears. He doesn't simply say, go to the land and find out what it's like. Instead, he limits the scouts' scope of vision so that when they go, whether they're aware of it or not, they had that first question in mind. Are the people there strong or weak? Are the people there strong? Are the people there going to be stronger than me? Of the many questions that Moses asked, the scouts come back to answer basically only that first one. You implied the people might be strong, so we saw strong people. Yes, the land was fruitful and beautiful, whatever. We could only see the strong people. We could only see the image that you had implanted in our minds. The scouts then famously say the people were so strong they looked to us like giants. We could see ourselves only as grasshoppers, so they must have seen us that way too. The image Moses had inadvertently planted into their minds had such an effect. It made them see the world only through that distorted lens. They could see the people of Canaan only as giants, and therefore themselves only as grasshoppers. Carrying Moses' expectations with them, they could only return diminished in their own eyes. When they said they looked to themselves like grasshoppers, what was the message underneath their words? And what about the brave Caleb, who dared to see himself differently from the expectation that Moses had set? I think back to that day in kindergarten, standing in line with Nicholas. Here was a boy at age 5 who was asking a question knowing the answer was supposed to be yes. This young boy already knew that he had a right to claim me. And there I was, the smartest, tallest, best, and only reader in the whole class, who knew that the answer no was not an option. But that for me, the answer yes wasn't either. I dared in that moment to see myself differently from the expectation that society had set upon me. I was able to see the message under his question, not the message coming from this 5-year-old child, but the message coming from the structures of society that raised us both. The question, like Moses's, had been asked with an assumption of the answer in mind. I was supposed to say yes, but I wanted so badly to say no. I wanted to say no so badly that I hurt him. And when I got in trouble, as I should have, I learned the wrong lesson. I should have learned that I could say no, that I could reject this assumption of my life and my role in the world. Instead, I learned to pretend that I wanted to say yes. I learned that other people were giants, and I was merely a grasshopper trying to blend in. That's not what should have happened. If only I could have learned to be like Caleb then, who was rewarded for the ways in which he stood differently from the others. If only somebody else could have heard the message that I heard underneath Nicholas's question. And if only someone could have heard the message underneath my response. Perhaps then I wouldn't have spent my middle and high school years following around girls and then young women, pretending to think about boys. Perhaps then someone could have shown me that there were other ways of living my life, other ways of safely and non-violently rejecting the assumption of society that I was going to grow up and want to marry a man. And then our congregation brought in Rabbi Nadia Saritsky. Rabbi Saritsky was the first lesbian I ever knew, or more accurately, the first lesbian I ever knew that I knew. Here was someone who embodied everything I wanted to be and everything I was afraid to believe could be possible. She was a rabbi and she had a wife. I was fascinated with her. I would go on to learn some of the most valuable lessons I've learned about the rabbinate from Rabbi Saritsky. How to be present for someone in times of crisis, how to listen when someone needs to be heard. But at first, all I could learn from Rabbi Saritsky is that perhaps I was possible. Perhaps there was a world in which I could exist in all the ways I had thought I couldn't. Perhaps I could be a rabbi. Perhaps I could be queer. This was the message that the temple sent to me when we hired Rabbi Saritsky, that I could be. She existed, and that meant maybe I could exist too. She was not only welcomed into our temple community, but hired to be here. She was wanted in this community. And that meant maybe I, in all my wholeness and all my queerness, could be wanted here too. Rabbi Saritsky was my Caleb. Her existence in our community showed me that it was possible to see the world through my own eyes and not the distorted lens that society's assumptions had placed on the bridge of my nose. This congregation and this community communicated to me that not only would I be tolerated, but I would be accepted. I could be wanted in this community, even if I were queer. This morning is my first Pride Shabbat with the temple. The tradition of celebrating Pride Month in this congregation began after I grew up and moved away. I have to say, the message has changed yet again. As a teenager, I read underneath the words of this congregation and saw that I, as a queer woman, was accepted. Today, thanks to the plague and Zoom, I get to come back to this congregation and see that I, as a queer woman, am celebrated. That is the message that Pride Shabbat sends. That all of my identities are not just tolerated, not just accepted, but celebrated. Each part of me, including my gender expression and my sexuality, are valuable and meaningful in this community. That is the message that we're sending through Pride Shabbat, and that is the message that matters. When we as a Jewish community celebrate Pride, or when we as a Jewish community celebrate Juneteenth, when we as a Jewish community celebrate each and every individual in their entire whole humanity, we become like Caleb. We take off the lenses of fear and assumption and expectation that our lives look and our society look like the lives and society of the people who came before us. We can see the land for all that it really is, flowing with milk and honey, grapes and pomegranate, grasshoppers and giants, Black and brown and bisexual and lesbian and non-binary and trans and abled in so many ways, and more beautiful for being built of each and every one of us. When we take off the assumptions that life progresses in only one way, we begin to see that we can truly exist. We begin to remove the expectations from our words so that one day, when our grandchild comes along and sits with us as we age, we can say simply, I always knew that about you. and I love you for existing as you are. Shabbat Shalom.